Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Ty Segall, titled Emotional Mugger. I have to be honest with y'all, on some level, Ty Segall kind of unsettles me. And I say that as a fan of the guy, starting when I dug deeply into his discography to cover his 2014 album Manipulator. His material might be prolifically scattershot, sprawling over a half dozen albums and even more side projects, but dig into his albums at length and you see a certain darkness that covers his writing that feels kind of unique, self-deprecating, but a little bit craven and sinister, narrowing its focus on darker, venial human impulses and sins that can feel a little bit disconcerting when the little stuff piles up into something that's really ugly. Now this has become most apparent with his cleanest and most cohesive album to date with Manipulator, which focused on a broad selection of manipulative situations that ultimately rung as more plainly nihilist. I mean, that's how he thought people communicated with each other, by manipulating them. But I had a feeling in my gut that that cleaner sound and atmosphere would not last. On some level, Ty Segall's material has always been at its best when the rougher instrumentation actually matched the subject matter, like on the excellent Slaughterhouse from the Ty Segall Band in 2012. And thus, when I heard that this release this year is going to go even darker, I was definitely intrigued. But one thing that I also noticed was the build-up. A longer than expected time between projects, the release announced with a mailing of VHS tapes to critical outlets, the creation of a website to announce and promote this album in the concept of emotional mugging, and the introduction of a new backing band, the Muggers, featuring longtime collaborator Mikhail Cronin, and a few new faces like the frontman of Juan, Corey Hansen, on guitar and keyboard. And when I say faces, I of course mean none at all, because the video released in all of that build-up featured the band in baby masks, which Ty Segall has continued to wear during live sets. So putting aside the obvious cue from modern horror games, it seems that right from the outset, Ty Segall was looking to be as unsettling as possible, strip away the prettier veneer on Manipulator for something a lot uglier. And honestly, that made me even more excited, especially if we were descending back into the wild madness that came with Slaughterhouse. So what did we get with Emotional Mugger? Well, honestly, while I get what this album was trying to do, I'm not exactly sure Ty Segall's Emotional Mugger manages to stick the landing for me. I've been through this album a good dozen times trying to untangle the intricacies of it, and while I think I've got a handle on the ideas that he was looking to explore and understanding him, it's definitely not one of my favorite albums of his. Less deliriously messy and explosive and raw than just venial and craven and debased and alien, which would have been fine if the underlying melodies and concepts were enough to support it in the execution, and I honestly don't think that they are. So let's start off with Ty Segall himself, and what I've said in the past about his vocals that I tend to prefer them when they're louder and rougher and more visceral, and that doesn't really happen on this album. Instead, following in a lot of the lo-fi glam rock that he's looking to imitate, he's opting for a higher, nasal, British accented sneer that isn't exactly bad, but yet pretty grating for repeated listens, especially considering how often he runs it through multiple distorted channels that don't exactly layer very well on top of each other. It's probably the worst on Mandy Cream, but at least he's mostly comprehensible on that song, where in other tracks like Baby Big Man, I Want a Mommy drowns him out in reverb, or its high crooning out falsetto on The Magazine is only really understandable on a hook, and that's kind of an issue given the underlying concept. You want to be able to hear what he's saying. Now granted, that song The Magazine goes off in a distinctly different direction instrumentally, with a bass-heavy foundation against much crisper drums and hand claps against the distant guitar, so I'm inclined to give it somewhat of a pass. It's a good sounding song. And hell, if I'm going to give Ty Segall some real credit here, the instrumentation on this record does kind of grow on you, as dank, fuzzed out, and sleazy as it is. The drum lines are sparse, but along with the burbling grime of the bass, they drive something of a groove for the spiky guitars to careen against, either dropping into lockstep melodic layers like on Squealer or Mandy Cream, or build up to some pretty impressive interplay like on Candy Sam or Californian Hills, the latter which breaks up the song with some jittery guitar pieces that end up working pretty damn well, probably my favorite song on this record. Hell, when this album actually builds more force and presence in the guitar line, we get some pretty damn solid songs like the darker chorus riffs on Breakfast Eggs, or the meaty driving riff of the cover Diversion. And while it almost becomes routine for every single song to end with a guitar solo, a lot of the solos are good enough so that it's not really a problem. Where it does get to be a bit of an issue is that some of these tracks don't so much evolve as they just kind of fall apart in your hands. Like the transition on the title track, or when Candy Sam doesn't so much end as it fades into an acoustic groove with children's voices singing out the melody, which I get is kind of creepy, but it does feel a little bit cliche for me. And that's when the melody evolves at all. Baby Big Man, I Want a Mommy tries to build something off of a turgid bass line and garish melody, and it's way too broad and borderline cartoonish to stick the landing for me. A problem that later shows up in the cleaner funnier and somehow less tolerable Squealer 2. And then there's WUOTWS, which is the sort of lo-fi experimental sound collage encapsulating the entire album that is honestly less dissonant than I expected with the binaural layering. It's not that bad, but it's not exactly something that I would ever feel inclined to revisit. It's not that good either. And yet, even the songs that I like from this record, when stacked against Ty Segall's best work, don't really measure up. Even on purely melodic basis in terms of how sticky and memorable they are, so do the lyrics save them? Well, let me start by talking about the whole concept underlining this album of emotional mugging, which basically means the creation and viewing of cheap and free digital content, with the ease of it all at your fingertips from your computer to your cell phone, making it an easy, addictive high that further pushes us away from deeper emotional connections, emphasizing the body over the mind. There's a very pornographic undercurrent to this album, and I kind of get why. And here's where Ty Segall does the most right, because this is very rich thematic territory that I really thought was intriguing. And Ty Segall manages to rise above his usual anti-technology rhetoric into some cogent points that I like. I like the shallow, wasting emptiness of Californian hills, and the anxious anticipation that comes on Squealer for wanting that high. I like how Diversion shows what happens when somebody who didn't get their payoff comes a knocking, and even though the self-absorption get kinda grating on Mandy cream through the lyrics, it kinda makes sense given how self-involved that the internet is. Hell, conceptually, I like how pathetic Baby Big Man I Want a Mommy feels like, and how the double metaphor of candy runs through the entire album, emphasizing the cheap but hollow thrill that kinda leaves you feeling empty, and the sexual connotation that comes with it. I kinda like the framing of this album too. The instrumentation and delivery puts all that sleaze on display in delirious excess, but the album then ends with the magazine, with the key lyric being on the hook, "You don't need a reason. As long as you're not hurting anyone, you know what you're doing to yourself, good or bad. That's your prerogative. I can't exactly stop you." And yet those fragments of insight are really just fragments over an album that would prefer to indulge in repetition, garish sleaze, and wank than opt for more insight. And with a concept that is as rich as this one is, that strikes me as a little bit wasteful. Furthermore, for as much artifice as there is on this record, I have a hard time finding the real emotional core. For as much as this album emphasizes those cheap, empty thrills, I can't help but feel that on some level, it's just like its subject matter, for better or for worse. And I guess I can kind of respect that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't give me a lot to work with. So in the end, look, this is a hard album for me to recommend, even to the fans, even speaking as a fan. Hell, it was a hard album for me to review, given that by making this content, this video here, I'm feeding into the same emotional mugging that Ty Segall is describing, which makes my content feel all the more hollow, which really leaves me on a sour note in this review. But to dissociate from all the meta text of all that, how's the music? Honestly, I think it's decent at best. Garish and sleazy and alien enough to draw a lot of attention, and for the most part it's very well played, but delve deeper in the inconsistencies in the composition and the tracks that don't really evolve and the undercooked lyrics really hold Emotional Mugger back. So for me, I'm giving this a very strong 6 out of 10. Conceptually interesting and more than a little bit unsettling, I can appreciate that, but ultimately just lacking the payoff musically to really stick with me. However, many have said this album will be very polarizing, so if what I described sounds interesting, definitely check this out. It's an experience, that's for damn sure. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you like, just like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this review will be controversial. As I said, it's probably going to be a polarizing listen, especially with all that content. But, so I can imagine you will have plenty of opinions about this. Please leave in the comments below. I'm definitely intrigued how you read this album. But otherwise, if there's anything else you want me to cover in the next upcoming weeks, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.